Happy Sunday, everyone, and hello from the Salt Lake Airport. I'm on my way to Uruguay, or as we gringos like to say, Uruguay. And wanted to take a moment here from the Sky Club to send out a musing on something that happened this week. Maybe you saw it in the press, but there was a new poll that came out with some rather interesting findings for members of our faith that I wanted to unpack a little bit. And this started, I was alerted first to this because on Twitter, I posted just some meme or whatever, and some, lefty, socialist, anti-Mormon, who knows, it's a big Venn diagram of all my critics and people who don't like me, that they share some of these attributes. But this individual said, "Hey Connor, did you read that poll result that came out in today's paper about the church? Yeah, you're why. W-H-Y. You are why." I'm like, what the heck is this talking about? So I go to the paper. I don't know why we call it that anymore. It's not really paper. But I went to the Salt Lake Tribune's website because I figured that's where this individual was, reading something about the church. And they had published an article highlighting a new poll that came out dealing with religion. And so this poll was conducted last September, so it's been a few months. They surveyed over 10,000 Americans, so very statistically significant sample size. And it was conducted by the Pew Research Center. So some of the top kind of major results that the Salt Lake Tribune was writing about and that this poll found, for example, 35% of Americans have favorable attitudes towards Jews, 35%, while 6% have unfavorable attitudes. So again, for Jews, 35% of Americans are giving a thumbs up, 6% giving a thumbs down. So then when you go to other religions, consider, for example, mainline Protestants, Americans have a 30% favorability rating and a 10% unfavorable. So again, still far more people are favorable to these particular religions than are unfavorable towards them. Catholics, 34% favorable and 18% unfavorable. Probably a lot of that was coming from the evangelicals, just because there's obvious, tension, or Protestants, and obvious kind of theological differences between the two. So 34% favorable for Catholics, 18% unfavorable for the Catholics. Okay, so now that takes us to us Mormons. What do Americans think about us? Again, for all these other religious groups, you've got far more, double, triple, 5, 6x more saying we're favorable towards these religious groups than are unfavorable. Well, it's the reverse for Mormons. A quarter of Americans say that they hold unfavorable views of Mormons, while only 15% express favorable opinions. So it's flipped. 15% favorable, 25% unfavorable. What's fascinating to me about this is that we fare worse than atheists. When you look at the breakdown of how Americans perceive atheists, 20% of them are favorable towards atheists, but only 15% of them are favorable towards the Mormons. We have the same unfavorability. They're at 20, atheists are at 24%, we're at 25%. But they have more people expressing an opinion of favorability towards atheists than for Mormons. Now, I should point out one little qualifier for those of you who understand how surveys work. The sample size of Mormons was rather small because obviously we are a tiny percentage of the overall American population. So what that means is out of over 10,000 respondents who were American respondents, there were only 79 individuals in this particular survey who were Mormon. So that means two things. First, it means that all of everyone else's perceptions about Mormons is statistically significant because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them all talking about Mormons. So what they say about us is statistically significant. But the reverse, is the perception about what Mormons feel about others, which I'm about to get into. And that you have to have a little more grain of salt, because when you are dealing with a poll that has a very small sample size, like 79 people, then the margin of error is substantially increased. According to Pew, with a pool of 79 people, they have a 95% confidence rate in the accuracy of the results. However, it has an 11% margin of error. Usually on polls with a broad sample size, it's at 2, 3, 4%. This is 11%, just because there's so few Mormons who were replying. So with what I'm about to share, actually in a few minutes, I think we have to keep that qualifier in mind, that there just weren't a lot of Mormons. So why don't Americans like Mormons? That, I think, is kind of the operative question. And I think a plausible answer is that their perceptions are rooted in ignorance. And the poll actually finds that a little bit. So, for example, fewer than half of those surveyed, 43%, said that they know a Mormon personally. And that's less than for evangelicals, Jews, Protestants, who are all at 64%. 64% of Americans said that they personally know an evangelical, a Protestant, a Jew. And Muslims were at 50%. Half of Americans personally, or say that they personally know a Muslim, but only 43% for Mormons. And so when you look at Protestants, for example, this is from the Pew results. Americans who say that they personally know a mainline Protestant are about 3 times as likely to rate them positively as negatively. So it's 38% to 12%. Among those who do not personally know a Protestant, identical shares hold favorable and unfavorable views of the group, 10% each. And most, 79%, don't offer an opinion. So for people who are like, I don't know a Protestant, 10% of them have a favorable perception, 10% of them have an unfavorable. But when they know a Protestant, it's a 3x gap. The favorability substantially increases. Well, this same pattern applies to Mormons. Non-Mormons who know someone who is Mormon not only are more likely than those who don't to express a favorable opinion. So it's in our case, it's 19% versus 10%. So take non-Mormons who know. Take non-Mormons who know a Mormon, then they give a 19% favorability. But if it's a non-Mormon who doesn't know a Mormon, then they give Mormons a 10% favorability. So it's a 2x instead of a 3x like it was for Protestants. But what's interesting to me about this is that the non-Mormons who know a Mormon, who say that they personally know a Mormon, they're also more likely not only to express a favorable view by about 2x, but an unfavorable view. So 31% of non-Mormons who say that they do know a Mormon have an unfavorable view of Mormons, whereas only 22% of non-Mormons who don't know any Mormons have an unfavorable view. So when non-Mormons know Mormons, they are more likely to have an unfavorable view about them, about us, which I find very interesting. So why don't they like us? What is it about being a Mormon that creates this type of division? Well, we'll get into the scriptural side in just a minute. But first, some additional polling data, which I think might shed some interesting light. This isn't from Pew. This is from Gallup, another reputable polling firm. And they looked at major moral issues on which major U.S. religious groups disagree. And the results are rather striking. Here's just a few. Take abortion, for example. So people were asked in these surveys over the many years whether they find this issue morally acceptable or not. So for abortion, 76% of Jews say that abortion is morally acceptable. 38% of Catholics, which are notoriously pro-life, 38% of Catholics say that abortion is morally acceptable. For those who don't have any religion, 73% say that abortion is a moral issue, which is fascinating because it was 76% for Jews. Jews are more likely than people without a religion to think that abortion is morally acceptable. Protestants are at 33%. A third of Protestants say that abortion is morally acceptable. Mormons, 18%. So you look at the delta between other religions and their position on just a single issue like this, and you can see how out of sync we are with other major religions. Let's do LGBT, gay and lesbian relations, kind of broadly speaking. And I take this to mean from the poll, questioning whether this issue is morally acceptable, the relationship itself, not gay marriage as a civic sacrament, if you will, but just the union of, gay and lesbian people. So 85% of Jews say that gay and lesbian relations are morally acceptable. 85%. Again, those with no religion, 83%. So Jews are more likely to be accepting and open to this being a morally acceptable issue. For Catholics, 62% say that these relations are morally acceptable, 41% for Protestants. Mormons, we're at 28%. So again, a big chasm of difference. Take premarital, having a child out of wedlock, having a baby outside of marriage. This was another moral issue that the pollsters were asking. For those with no religion, 80% said that that's morally acceptable to have a baby outside of marriage. Jews were at 68%. Catholics were at 59%. Protestants were at 47%. Mormons were down at 25%. Which, take abortion and the Catholics, right? The fact that 38% were saying that abortion is a moral issue just shows that those Catholics responding were not faithful Catholics, because the Catholic Church is notoriously pro-life on the abortion issue as a matter of doctrine and faith. And so when we say Catholics or Jews or Mormons, we're just talking about people who have a wide range of fidelity and commitment to the doctrines of the church with which they claim an affiliation. So how is it that 25% of Mormons are saying that having a baby outside of marriage is okay when that's emphatically prohibited and discouraged? Something that can be repented from or whatever. It's no reason to give someone a scarlet letter, but as to say that it's morally acceptable to have a baby outside of marriage, that's a more that's a question that surprises me that 25% say yes. Okay, let's do just a couple more examples to show the contrast. Polygamy was funny. 26% of people with no religion said that polygamy is morally acceptable. 18% of Jews. Mormons were down at 8%. So we've become so anti-polygamy now, trying to disassociate ourselves from all those early church leaders and all their polygamous shenanigans. I thought that was a rather interesting one. One that I disagree with, for example, death penalty. People saying it's morally acceptable to have a government-imposed death penalty. Those of no religion, 62% said it's morally acceptable. Jews were at 54%. Mormons were up at 79%. We were the highest. Protestants were at 66%. Catholics were at 61%. Mormons are the most likely of the major religious groups, or those of no religion, to call the death penalty morally acceptable, which I think is ridiculous because it's not. A divinely imposed death penalty is fine in a theological government led by prophets, but led by fallible people who can't even deliver your mail on time is a ridiculous idea, full of problems. But that's a topic for another day. The point in sharing all of these issues is to show that I think there are some insights there as to why people of other faiths find significant disagreement with us and maybe don't like us. It's clear that on major moral issues, we are at odds on a number of topics with people from other religions. So that may have a key. Certainly plays like the Book of Mormon and, the South Park and all these like cultural commentaries poking fun at perceived Mormon, doctrines and cultural oddities doesn't help, because it furthers these stereotypes. The fact that we're a newer church, I think, right? Whereas other churches have had centuries and millennia to kind of bake into the cultural zeitgeist and be acceptable and one of us, but we're kind of the newer, weirder kid on the block. So I mentioned earlier that these feelings are not reciprocal. How other people feel about us as Mormons is not reciprocated by Mormons. Again, the sample size is smaller, so we have to have that qualifier that the numbers might be off by a little bit. But generally speaking, there's a massive, massive chasm between what Mormons feel about others and what others feel about us. So, for example, how do Mormons feel about the other religious groups? Well, according to the poll and those surveyed, what they did here for these results is they took the percentage of favorability, and then they subtracted the percentage of unfavorability. Imagine that Mormons said that they had a 20% favorability towards Protestants and an 18% unfavorability. Well, then the final number would be 2%. And that's what this portion of the poll is talking about. What's the net positive when you take the positive and subtract out the unfavorability? So for Mormons, when they look at evangelical Christians, it was scored 43. In other words, it was a higher number of favorability, a little bit of unfavorability that they subtract. So it's a total balance of opinion plus 43. Mainline Protestants plus 51 of what Mormons feel about them. Catholics plus 53. So high favorability, hardly any unfavorability, right? Jews, 58, they're at the top. We have profound disagreement with today's Jews, and a lot of them are just super liberal and left, and of course a lot of Mormons are conservative, so that probably has a lot to do with it. But plus 58 for Jews. Of course, we have this kind of affinity, and at least we feel that we do, and I don't know that that's really reciprocated. Muslims, plus 37 of what Mormons feel about Muslims, plus 37. Atheists, plus 6. So we're positive about everybody to varying degrees, but when looking at all these other groups, it's all totally positive. And then when you flip it, it's totally in the negative. So Protestants have a -8 score for Mormons of what they perceive, so more unfavorability than favorability. Let's see, that was Protestants. Catholics have they have a +2. Okay, we barely made it into the positive spectrum, and that's the only positive number we got from anyone. Again, so they had slightly more favorability towards us than unfavorability. Jews, even though we scored them the highest at plus 58, they score us at a -13. -13 of what Jews perceive about Mormons. For those who are religiously unaffiliated, atheists score us at a -55. And maybe we can find consolation in the fact that atheists score evangelical Christians at a -76. So they got it worse than us. Agnostics put Mormons at a -30. What's fascinating about this that I said a moment ago is that Mormons weren't expressing a net negative opinion towards any group. And it's also interesting that Mormons were the only ones who view Muslims positively. Everyone else had a net negative score for Muslims. Okay, so let's kind of drive all this towards the conclusion. Should we care? Should we care that Americans don't like Mormons? Like, we're a missionary church, we're supposed to preach the gospel, we're supposed to, get the word out, and for that we have to be liked, we have to be respected, we have to have a platform on which to share our ideas, so should we care? Well, I look at 1 Samuel 8, when the children of Israel wanted to be, quote, like all the nations, and so they demanded a king. They wanted to fit in. They didn't want to stand out. And so God warned them, you're going to be enslaved, they're going to take your property, you're going to have taxes, your daughters, your sons sent off to war, and all these things, right? No, we don't care. We want to be like all the nations. And so I think we have this cultural tendency to want to fit in as humans, but that has dangers. We shouldn't try and fit in with everybody else. there is validity into being a so-called peculiar people. God wants to call us out, to flee from Babylon, to not ingratiate ourselves within it. So imagine if there was a poll done in Jesus's day, and people were asking him, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Samaritans and all these people, what's your favorability towards, Jesus and his followers? He probably would have scored very low. So the fact that people are scoring Mormons with such negative numbers, I don't think is really any indication that we're doing anything wrong, when I think that Jesus himself would have been in the net negative had he been asked by his peers of other faiths or no faith what they think about him. I've shared in the past this story of Russell M. Nelson shortly after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq were starting up, and he gave this talk in General Conference. I think it was called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, but the whole talk was about renouncing war, proclaiming peace, that Jesus is the Prince of Peace, that we have to follow the golden rule, not just as individuals, but as countries, as governments, we have to follow the golden rule. It was this amazing and well-timed address speaking to all of the frothing at the mouth of Americans wanting to go to war and get back at Saddam Hussein, even though he had no part in 9/11 and all this garbage, right? So Russell M. Nelson gets up and he gives this address, and the American media establishment was swift in its opposition. The Associated Press and all these outlets start fanning the flames and saying that the Mormon Church has taken a hardline position and against the war and painting it in a very negative light. And the biggest criticism I have of that whole episode, I wrote about this. If you're not familiar with this story, I wrote about this in Christ versus Caesar. The tragedy of that episode, from my perspective, is that the church's PR department reversed course. They downplayed the potency and the impact of what was in then Elder Nelson's address. They sidestepped all of it and ignored it, and they put out this weak, ridiculous press release saying like, oh, President Nelson said it's important to serve the country in which you live, and we are loyal to our governments and all these things, right? And so they emphasized this like one line or one paragraph from his talk where he did have this almost kind of throwaway line about, yes, you got to do your duty, but, X, Y, and Z and peace and golden rule and all the rest. And so the core and the vast majority of the address had to do with this very anti-war, pro-peace message, and the church's PR department just punted on it instead of doubling down and saying, this is our doctrine, this is what God has commanded us to do. Sorry you don't like it. Sorry you're trying to cancel us. Sorry you're trying to attack us as being, insufficiently patriotic and, traitors or whatever, right? But God wants us to do this. God has commanded us to do this. It was the right position. Elder Nelson's position was doctrinal, it was timely, it was relevant, and yet, seemingly for the desire to not become social outcasts in our own community, the church's PR department reversed course and undid the impact of what that address could have been and could have accomplished. So I think oftentimes we might care too much about what other people think about us, rather than saying unabashedly, this is our doctrine, this is what we believe. We can say it with compassion, we can say it with passion, we can be sincere but still respectful, right? We can do all those things but still be very firm and bold of what God has said. And yet we lost that opportunity to do it. Matthew 10 has this quote, this scripture you've heard before, where he says, this is verses 37 through 36. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth, which is a funny thing for the Prince of Peace to say. Do not think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. So here's the Prince of Peace himself saying that by following him, there is necessarily going to be division. The true followers of Christ are never going to be liked by the Babylonian, whorish, Caesarean society of which they are a part, because they are at complete odds with one another. No man can serve two masters. I did an episode, a musing, a few months ago called Choosing Christ Creates Contention. And it was based on this scripture and others like it, where when we are truly following Christ, we're not going to be liked, because inherently we are, condemning certain actions and prohibiting certain things and saying that this is wrong or this is right. And, the guilty taketh the truth hard, because it cutteth them to the center. People don't like to be told. I mean, look at the Old Testament. It's full of examples of these prophets going in front of kings and rebuking them for their idolatry, their wickedness, and so forth. And then, they get chased out of town, they get stoned, they get thrown in pits, and all the rest, because, the establishment, the society never likes to be told that what they're doing is wrong. By the way, I put it in, if you're watching on Facebook, I put it in the description for this video. But I mentioned this, I think, a couple weeks ago that I was doing this. So I now have a website, sundaymusings.org, where you can go and filter by topic. So you can go look up, musings on various different doctrinal, scriptural, historical type issues, filter it down, and then it'll show you which musings have to do with that. So if you ever get behind, or you're a newcomer to these weekly Sunday musings, you can go to sundaymusings.org at any time and go check those out. All right, let's wrap up with two scriptures, pertinent verses that have to do with this topic of whether we are liked or disliked by the society in which we live. First one comes from John 15, verses 19 and 20. He says, "If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you." So if we are truly following Christ, we're going to be persecuted. He's chosen us out of the world, and therefore the world will hate us. Like it just, we can't have it any other way. We desire so much to have this positive image and this kind of Mitt Romney-esque Americana of, look, we fit in and we're just like you, and apple pie and all the rest. We're Americans, red-blooded just like all of you. But we can't fit in. And yes, there's a point to which it's appropriate to just try and persuasion 101, right? Try and be liked, try and have open, positive relationships with others so that you can have dialogue and hopefully persuade them and share the gospel. I'm not saying that we should go, live out in the woods and isolate ourselves from society and not try to share our influence. We've been commanded to share our influence, but we've been chosen out of the world, and so the world will hate us. We're always going to have those, like when we're doing what's right, when we're standing up on principle, when we're following God closely, not with our caveats that we put on it and the creative interpretations that we make to his commandments and the ones we ignore and the ones we are willing to follow because they're easy, right? But when we're truly following God, we are not going to be liked. The world is going to hate us because we are at odds with what they want to do and what they want to get away with and what they want to be whispered sweet nothings in their ears that, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? They don't like to be told that that's wrong and that there's a better way. So they don't like us to the extent that we're actually standing on doctrine and truth and taking these positions and following Christ. Okay, so that was John 15. Final set of verses is from 1 Nephi 8. This is no surprise to any of you. I'm sure you thought of this as I was talking about the last set of scriptures. This comes from the vision where Nephi is talking about what his father saw, then what he saw later. And so this is verses 33 through 34. "And great was the multitude that did enter into that strange building, the great and spacious building. And after they did enter into that building, they did point the finger of scorn at me and those that were partaking of the fruit also. But we heeded them not. These are the words of my father," writes Nephi, "for as many as heeded them had fallen away." So we're very familiar with those verses, of course, but they have a lot of wisdom in there for us when we see results like from this poll that there's such high unfavorability towards us. That we are trying to stand out. We are trying to follow God. We are trying to live his commandments, both ancient and modern. And by so doing, we are alienating ourselves from the culture in which we live. Not completely, because again, we need to go out and do missionary work and we need to have that influence. But if we are following God, then Caesar and Satan and all his minions are not going to like that, and they're going to attack it. And the scriptures are full of examples and prophecies and all the rest. So I think Americans hate Mormons because I just think, yes, it's because of ignorance. Yes, a lot of people don't know Mormons. Yes, they're relying on pop culture and, sister wives and all these things that talk about Mormons. And so they're forming opinions based off of inaccurate, misleading, things out of context, blah, 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 right? Like, I think that is a valid answer. But I think fundamentally that Mormons, so-called Christians, followers of the way, if you've read my Christ versus Caesar book, followers of the way are going to be disliked because by their action, they are inherently stating that other ways are not the way, that other courses, this broad path, right? Here's Nephi in his the vision with Lehi talking about the straight and narrow path, but the broad path that leads to wandering and getting lost and finding your way to the great spacious building. Everyone prefers to go down there. There's freedom, right? Do what you want, eat, drink, and be merry. Speak your truth, pick your path, go where you want to go. I mean, this is the whole, I'm going to pull this up really quick and I've shared it before. I just love this set of verses. This is from Doctrine and Covenants 1, and this was the preface that the Lord gave to the Doctrine and Covenants. So he had been given these revelations through Joseph, and then they're compiling them into the Book of Commandments. And so Joseph gets this revelation, which was intended specifically to come at the very beginning of this compiled set of revelations. And in there, God is talking about why he restored the gospel in the modern day. He talks about this day in which the arm of the Lord will be revealed. The day cometh that who will not hear the voice of the Lord, neither the voice of his servants, neither give heed to the words of prophets and apostles, shall be cut off from among the people. For they have strayed from mine ordinances, they've broken mine everlasting covenant. They seek not the Lord to establish his righteousness, but every man walketh in his own way, and after the image of his own God, whose image is in the likeness of the world, and whose substance is that of an idol, which waxeth old and shall perish in Babylon. That, to me, is the exact problem that Joseph's society 2 centuries ago was dealing with, but certainly our own, with the proliferation of moral relativism and people no longer having this shared perception of objective reality, but everyone's just speaking their truth and doing what they want. And every man walketh in his own way and after the image of his own God, whose image is in the likeness of the world. So when we are trying to seek the Lord to establish his righteousness, when we're trying to walk on the straight and narrow, just as Lehi saw in the vision, there are going to be people pointing the finger of scorn and how ridiculous and all the rest, right? But Jesus says that the servant is not greater than the master. If the master was persecuted, if Jesus was persecuted, so will we be. And so these poll results, we can get prideful about this. We can say, oh, look, this is confirmation, right? That we're, the fact that we're not liked means that we must be doing something right. And I don't think it's that simplistic to say that just because people don't like us means that God approves of us. I mean, people can dislike us for any number of reasons, and that doesn't mean that we are actually truly followers of the way and doing what Christ wants and boldly declaring his doctrine. So the two are not perfectly aligned, but the fact that we rank so poorly, for whatever reason, I don't think is a reason to be frustrated. I do, maybe I should do a whole separate musing about this. I think I will. This question of why so many young people are leaving the church. And I'll just kind of give a little tease of where I would go if I do that musing. And I think it's because we're watering down the church. We're not being committed to the doctrine. We're not It's Joseph Smith from the Lectures on Faith. He says something like, a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things does not have the power sufficient to lead to exaltation. Or I got that about 80% right. But the point is that, this is supposed to be hard, and we're supposed to be pure, and we're supposed to be committed. And when we try and ignore inconvenient doctrines or soft pedal them or try to be liked or try to de-emphasize things to fit into society and all the rest, we end up watering down the bold doctrine that I think is attractive to a lot of people. If we were to lean into things, we would have pissed a lot of people off if the church had doubled down on Elder Nelson's peace address in a post 9/11 fog of war when everyone's all just, frothing at the mouth to just go kill brown people halfway across the world. We would have been attacked by a lot of people. Okay, we would have had a very high unfavorability rating, no doubt. But who would we have attracted to the church? Who would have been converted to the gospel for seeing such a bold stance, for seeing finally a Christian community that's willing to stand up and oppose these ridiculous wars? We're missing something, I think, when we're not leaning into the doctrines that many people find challenging or inconvenient because the society in which we live does not like them. So I think we got to double down. I think we got to be proud about what we believe, if we in fact believe it. All right, time to fly off to the airport. No, I'm at the airport. Time to fly off on the plane to Uruguay. So I'll do a musing next week. Maybe I'll share some observations from being way there down south. Get a little beach time, be warm, be nice to leave the cold here. Remember again, the new website, sundaymusings.org. If you'd like to go find, I often get DMs from people that are like, hey, you should do a musing on issue X or Y or Z. And I'm like, I've done one already. So now I have a rather convenient way to just say, go to this website, filter down in the drop down, and you'll find it. Whereas before, people would have to just, scroll and read each one and figure out. And so this will, I think, be much more convenient. If you've got requests for that website of features to add or topics for musings, feel free to shoot me a DM. Super easy to find. I got a long list of musings to do, so I don't necessarily need any help there, but I always welcome your input. I also welcome your reviews. So if you head to the Apple Podcast app and leave a review, this is on Stitcher and Spotify and other things too. So I guess whatever platform you're on, leave a review. That just helps boost the algorithm so that more people can see it and we can talk and reach and help even more people who are working through some of these issues. So sundaymusings.org. Hope you guys have a wonderful Sabbath, and I'll catch you next week.